Right, does this clicker work? Okay, I actually don't have a presentation. This is the only slide that matters. I hope everybody knows what that is. That's the SpaceX Starship. It's hopefully going to launch on an orbital test flight later today at 4:30 p.m. Riga time. You should all watch it. This is history in the making, and I'm going to talk about this. But it's so good to be back in Riga. I was here a year ago to run the marathon. This is much more relaxing, although my heart rate is still going to be up talking about space. And it's great to have an event like the Deep Tech Atelier. We definitely need many more deep tech titled events in Europe in comparison with the US. So my congratulations to Leah and the ministry. But so let's talk from deep tech to deep space. And by the way, I'm not creative enough to come up with a nice title like this. I asked ChatGPT. This was literally suggested by ChatGPT. If you don't know what ChatGPT is, you're at the right event to learn about it. But let's talk about space. I want to tell you a little bit about why the space economy is so exciting right now, what it is, what some of the main business models are, and how, and very importantly, how people who are not yet in the space sector can participate in the space sector. Because I really believe there is space, pun intended, for everybody in the space sector. Now, I teach at some universities on these topics in a semester-long course. We're going to try to do it in 15 minutes, so bear with me. It's going to be warp speed. So coming to the first question, why space, why now? I mean, hasn't space been around for a long time? The first rocket flew to space in 1944, a German V2. The first people walked on the moon in 1969. It seems like it's been around for many, many decades. But we are at an inflection point right now. And the inflection point is substantially about the fact that space is just getting much, 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 much cheaper. And let's explore this in some more detail. So what is getting cheaper? First of all, there's a massive decrease in the cost of accessing space. So this is about taking rockets to go to space, to put satellites there, to put people, to put space stations, whatever. And very often in the industry, we look at a very simple metric. How much does it cost to take 1 kilogram of mass to what we call a low Earth orbit? This is roughly where the International Space Station is, 400 or 500, up to 2,000 kilometers altitude. And until very recently, the price to take 1 kilogram of mass up to low Earth orbit would have been something like $10,000 or more on quote-unquote traditional rockets. Then SpaceX came along, not yet with this vehicle, with the vehicle they're currently using, which is the Falcon 9, which you may know. And probably many of you have seen those videos of the Falcon 9, the first stage, the booster, coming back to land propulsively, either on a drone boat or on land. Now, the fact that you do that, you bring back the first stage, I mean, SpaceX doesn't give out any numbers, it's a private company, but you can triangulate that booster probably cost maybe something like $30 million. If you threw it away, as was usually done with rockets, your cost for one launch, just the booster, is $30 million. If you reuse it, let's say 10 times, and if we use some of them more than 10 times, the cost is not 30 million, it's 30 million divided by 10 or more, right? It's like $3 million plus whatever refurbishment cost they may have. Now, the other thing that actually is very important, which SpaceX has also done very well, is the reusability doesn't do you any good by itself. You need to keep using, right? You need to keep reusing. This is what we call the cadence, the launch cadence. And SpaceX is flying a lot. Last year and currently, they're flying more than once a week. And this also helps the economies of scale. They have somewhat cheated on this because they're creating a lot of their own demand, because they're deploying a massive satellite communications network called Starlink, which you may be aware of, which may have tens of thousands of satellites up in space eventually. Right, but this is the Falcon 9, this is currently, and I told you that we started very recently with $10,000 cost to take 1 kilogram of mass to low Earth orbit. If you use the Falcon 9, if you take the entire rocket, you're somewhere about $2,500, so call it a 75% decrease. If you don't take the entire rocket, you go on something that's called rideshare, together with many other customers. The current price is $6,000, it's soon going to $6,500. They don't have to price any cheaper because they don't have any competition, but the cost is probably much, much lower. But this is the current rocket that SpaceX has, the current transportation cost. There is a reason we're looking at this picture. Partly because it's flying hopefully later today, but partly because this may change absolutely everything. So this is, again, this is called the Starship. It's a two-stage vehicle. The silver part on the bottom here, that's what's called a super heavy booster. And on top, this is the second stage. That's what's actually called the Starship. And the whole thing is called the Starship as well, just to be confusing. Now, the entire vehicle, both stages are reusable. both of these stages come back to Earth and land propulsively. This thing is massive. This is about 120 meters high. It's taller than a Saturn V. It's more powerful than a Saturn V. It has a payload capacity, so how much stuff, satellites or other things you can take up there, of over 100 metric tons. The current one, the Falcon 9, has a maximum of 23.6 tons. Most of the time it flies maybe with half that. Over 100 tons, this is a massive amount of mass to take to space. And because both of these elements are reusable, the cost is going to drop even further. What Elon Musk wants to do with this, and he has said this multiple times, he wants to take spacecraft, rockets, basically to the same place where aircraft are. You just keep reusing, and your marginal cost is basically going to be the fuel, I should say the propellant, because rockets have fuel and then what's called oxidizer, and whatever maintenance and refurbishment costs you have. Now Elon has thrown out various numbers over the years, but one number he has thrown out is that he thinks within 2 or 3 years, the cost of one launch of this could be $10 million. $10 million, I told you, is 100 metric tons. You can do the math. That would mean the cost of launching 1 kilogram of mass to low Earth orbit would drop to $100. That's crazy. We started at 10,000, right? Like, that's the cost, right? Mind you, not the price, right? Because they don't have any competition. But let it be 500. That would still be a 95% drop in cost. And let me tell you, before I did space stuff, I used to be a generalist investor investing in many, many different industries when I was at hedge funds. I don't know any industry which goes through a price decrease, a cost decrease like this, and it doesn't have a massive impact. And there's historical analogies I can draw on. There's one I mentioned in my book, which is about the US West and the development of the US West. I'll briefly tell you about it. I take you back to California, not current California, but in the year 1850. The population of California in the year 1850 was 90,000 people. And even in 1858, there was no railroad connection. You could take a railroad part of the way, and then for the last 2,000 miles, you spent a few weeks in a horse-drawn carriage, what they call a stagecoach. And there was a risk of getting robbed on the way and everything else. It was really very inconvenient, and it wasn't a very efficient way of transportation. Then in 1869, they built the first transcontinental railway, so really connecting the US East, where most of the developed cities were, like Boston and New York, to the US West, to California. And that dropped the transportation price, the estimate is, from the US East to the West by 85%. Hey, that's lower than the number I just gave you for space. Do you think that had any impact, the 85% drop of transportation to the US West? It did, and there's various metrics we can look at. So the 90,000 people population in 1850, by 1900, it was 1.5 million people in California. The US GDP went up 8 times over this period. And the transportation sector, which was substantially railroads, at times represented 2/3 of the entire stock market value in the US. This is how important the railroad sector was. So again, Starship is really, really important, and they're supposed to launch between 4:30, 5:30 p.m. local time. Try to watch the live stream. So this is transportation cost to space, dropping maybe 95%, maybe 99%, who knows. But that's not the only thing. Everything else, the cost for everything else in space is dropping as well. And this is the cost of spacecraft, like satellites or space stations, and the components that make up those spacecraft. And I'll give you an example to really illustrate this. So imagine a satellite for imaging the Earth, what we call a remote sensing or an Earth observation satellite. There was, for example, one in the US in the 1970s. It was a spy satellite. I mean, as you know, spy satellites, that's one big use case for satellites. It was called a Hexagon. It was the size of a school bus. It weighed about 13 tons. Each mission of each Hexagon satellite cost a few $100 million in today's money. And then I'll take you, this was in the 1970s, I'll take you forward 40 plus years to the mid-2010s, not even the latest generation of imaging satellites. You have something by a commercial space company called Planet. It's called the Planet Dove. It actually has better performance, better what we call spatial resolution than that 1970s really big, really expensive satellite. But that satellite is about 30 centimeters long. It weighs a few kilograms. And each mission doesn't cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Right? So Notice the cost decreases. And what are the reasons for these cost decreases in the spacecraft and their components? There's probably two main reasons. One is the general deflation. Everything in technology is getting cheaper. I think everybody notices that all the time, right? But the other important reason is economies of scale. In the space sector, we used to do stuff in really small unit numbers. You know, like some companies building a big satellite, maybe 1 or 2 a year. The same with rockets. Now we're just starting to go towards something that may resemble more mass manufacturing in space. SpaceX, they're building their own satellite communications satellites in-house for their Starlink communications network, currently probably at a clip of about over 200 satellites a month, rather than a handful per year, right? You can imagine the economies of scale. So that's the other big reason costs are coming down. General tech deflation, and then economies of scale because of higher unit numbers. But there was another important thing I hinted at when I gave you this comparison between the big US spy satellite and the Planet, the current commercial satellites, which was the size of a school bus, and then better performance now in 30 centimeters size. And that's another general tech trend, right? Miniaturization. Stuff is getting smaller, right? I mean, imagine the computing power I have in my cell phone. Like this used to be like room-sized computers decades ago. And miniaturization, of course, is really important in the space sector because, you know, size typically correlates with mass, and we've been discussing at length that how important mass is as a cost driver of taking stuff to space. So what you have there is, if you take all of these different effects, is what in my book I call the triple whammy effect. So the cost of taking 1 kilogram to space is going down materially, maybe 95%, maybe more. But the cost of the stuff you put into that kilogram, even if you hold the capability constant, is decreasing. But the capability is not staying constant. The capability in that 1 kilogram is constantly increasing, right? So you see what's going on there. The cost of taking a capability to space is really decreasing very, very, very much, very significantly. And I've been wanting to estimate this, like the combination of all of these effects for a while, and I never got to it. And then, fortunately, about a year ago, friends at McKinsey, they were nice enough, they did the calculation in a paper they published about 1 year ago. And they again took a similar example, what's called a medium resolution Earth observation satellite, so a satellite imaging the Earth, right? And they compared one from 2013 to another satellite with similar capability in 2022. And so how much did the cost decrease from 2013 to 2022 for that imaging capability? Any guesses? No? Okay, I'll just tell you. 3,500 times. That's their estimate. So that's crazy. That's between 3 to 4 orders of magnitude of cost decreases in taking a capability of space. And so that is really, really amazing. Space is getting really, really cheap. And then there's one other thing going on, which I also want to tell you about, which is important for people who want to be space entrepreneurs. Space is not only getting cheaper, it's also getting easier. These companies that, for example, do satellite imaging of the Earth, like let's say if you started 10 years ago or 15 years ago, like commercial companies like Planet, the one I already mentioned, you pretty much had to do everything in-house yourself. Planet was building its own satellites. They were arranging the launch for the satellite with the rocket provider themselves. They were then operating the satellite themselves. I mean, and that's all a pain in the behind, right? Nowadays, there is a number of what's called space-as-a-service providers where, let's say you have such a business model, like you want to image the Earth for a certain purpose. I don't know, maybe agriculture. You go to those space-as-a-service companies, and they do everything for you. They give you the satellite, they launch the satellite for you with a launch partner, and they then operate the satellite. And you actually just pay a monthly fee, which is also important, right? Because you went from quite significant upfront investment, capital expenditure, to operating costs on a monthly basis. So the barrier to becoming a space entrepreneur is also much, much lower than it used to be like just a few years ago. We're nowhere near the internet yet, don't get me wrong. It's not as easy as setting up an internet shop or something, but it's much better than it used to be. So what does all of that mean? The fact that space has become so much cheaper and it's easier to be an entrepreneur now. It means basically that a lot of space-related business models that never made any economic sense, you now have to look at everything again, whether it's not now feasible. Space is not only for governments anymore. It's absolutely feasible to be an entrepreneur, a space entrepreneur today. And so what are the business models? You have some traditional ones, like we've We're talking a lot about like satellite imaging, Earth observation, or remote sensing as it's called. There's of course satellite communications, a very big business. And then you have satellite navigation. But there's also emerging business models like space tourism, in-space manufacturing, business models on the moon, and we could do an entire lecture just on the moon because accessing the moon for similar reasons is also getting much cheaper. And even stuff like asteroid mining. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Asteroid mining, a couple of companies tried 10, 15 years ago. Both went bankrupt. It was too early. It was too expensive. There were other reasons. Now there's a new US company, at least one, but one that's publicly known, which is currently doing a $15 million financing round successfully to go asteroid mining. I know the founder well, and he said, Raphael, you know, like a few years ago, taking a rocket to deep space for the asteroid mining, it would have cost me $400 million just for the rocket. I'm doing it now for a few $1,000,000, right? The cost decreases. Another example, in-space manufacturing. Why would you want to do that? Well, it's because you have special conditions in space, right? Like principally microgravity, some others as well, like a hard vacuum and radiation. But microgravity has a number of beneficial effects. And so speaking of science and how science generates companies, I successfully licensed technology from one of the big Swiss universities end of last year, which we believe is the best technology in the world to grow human organ tissue in microgravity, which allows you to grow really cleanly in 3 dimensions, no scaffolding, no matrix, no contaminating materials, better differentiation than on Earth of the cells. And this has use cases in preclinical drug testing and in regenerative medicine. We're really excited about this company. It's called Prometheus Life Technologies, and it's based in Switzerland. It was founded end of last year, and it's already proudly a member of the ESA Business Incubation Center in Switzerland, and we also won what's called the Orbital Reef Innovation Challenge in the US. Now, for all of these reasons, all of these different business models that are now possible, that's why you have these projections that the gentleman before, when he introduced me, mentioned that some investment banks are thinking now the space economy is going to be like $1 trillion within 10 years or more. I mean, frankly, I'm old enough to remember the internet. Those projections, the investment banks, they don't know. But for all of these drivers I told you about, I really do believe we're going to have this type of growth. But you know what actually excites me the most about space and potential business models? It's not those business models we necessarily already know about today. Again, I'm old enough to remember the internet in the late 90s. And actually, I was at university in the mid-1990s in the US, so we had already very early on the internet there at university. And I remember the applications were like email, it was like really bad web browsing, it was some online games, there was like a really famous online backgammon server and a chess server, and then Amazon started selling books. Nobody, when I was at school, and this is a top school in the US, with like very smart people, and actually Elon was overlapping with me for a year there, nobody I knew at the school was thinking about business models like Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, even Tinder, but all of those companies happened because smart people figured out over the years what the internet meant and how to use that to build really significant businesses. And here in space, we are still really, really early. And I'll tell you why. Like, in my day job, besides the biotech company Prometheus, I'm a space investor, right? We've invested in something like 20 space startups already. We're getting business plans every day. Almost 100% of the business plans we get are basically founders from within the space sector. And that cannot stay this way, right? What we need to have happen is the same thing as happened with the internet, that people from outside the space sector come in and realize what can they do with space technology, right? And so this can be any of you in the audience, right? If you're a scientist, if you're working with some other type of deep tech, there's probably some synergy with space, right? You can quantum computing, several use cases in space. Advanced materials, several use cases in space. Biotechnology, I already mentioned, Fabrice already mentioned. Artificial intelligence, obviously. So all of the other deep tech sectors have synergies with the space sector. But importantly also, if you're not from any of the deep tech sectors, if you're here in the audience and maybe you're from a quote-unquote traditional sector like agriculture, insurance, oil and gas, mining, space technology can almost certainly help you with satellite data, with satellite communications, with navigation, maybe even with something crazier sounding like in-space manufacturing. So all of you should have an incentive to learn about space. It's not for governments anymore, it's for everybody, and it can really bring benefits to everybody. And I believe, you know, these benefits will be really important. We can probably solve many of the problems we have, the challenges we have on Earth, like food security, health security, climate change, using space technology. I do believe it's a positive impact investment as well. Right. And finally, I think space is just really exciting. You know, it's like a nice place to be as an entrepreneur. If you build a space company, people typically come to you as employees and they're just excited to work in a space company. This is one advantage we have you cannot underestimate, right? It's different from many other sectors. I mean, people just intuitively, emotionally like space. I mean, who doesn't like space? I joked at another conference, if you say you don't like space, that's on the same level as saying like you don't like babies or you don't like kittens or something. It's like everybody likes space, and that means people are typically very motivated to work on really crazy stuff like this. And typically also once people join the space sector, they don't leave again. I don't know any ex-space people. So I motivate you all to really learn a little bit more about space. There's more and more materials out there, fortunately. So I just published my own introductory book, non-technical to the space economy, which is here, it's called To Infinity. It just came out a week ago on Amazon. The QR code is going to take you straight to the book page. Besides that, I also have a few online courses. If you look me up on LinkedIn, you will find most of my education outreach activities. The other thing I would suggest, I have an almost weekly podcast where I interview space entrepreneurs and other prominent people from the space sector, which is also a great way to learn about the existing and future space business models. So I hope I was able to, quote unquote, indoctrinate you a little bit about the space sector and how you as well can participate and motivate you to learn more about it. Again, do watch the Starship launch. Fingers crossed it's going to go to orbit today. It's a historical moment. You will remember where you were. This is really, really significant. And I've asked ChatGPT as well to create a special cocktail to commemorate this launch. And if it really happens, then I shall have this cocktail later on at the happy hour. Thank you so much. I don't know if we have time for any questions. No? Okay.